Mama says Santa forgot us again this year. The small voice cut through the December wind, like a confession whispered to the universe itself, and Vigo Belmonte's hand froze halfway to his untouched espresso. The child materialized from the swirling snow with the sudden presence of ghosts in old stories, too small for the weather, and far too young to be alone in this abandoned corner of the city. Vigo had chosen this particular bus stop precisely because no one ever came here. 2 blocks removed from the festival lights and celebration that made his jaw clench with memories he refused to name. The boy couldn't have been more than 6 years old, drowning in a threadbare sweater with sleeves that stopped several inches short of his wrists, exposing skin reddened by cold. His jeans hid awkwardly above cheap sneakers that had seen better seasons, and the backpack clutched against his chest looked like it contained everything that mattered in his small world. Those enormous eyes studied Vigo with the kind of directness that adults learn to mask, unfiltered assessment that saw expensive wool coat and Italian leather shoes, but somehow looked past them. Vigo had spent 15 years perfecting the expression that made grown men reconsider their life choices, the particular set of his shoulders that communicated danger without a single word spoken. He'd built an empire on the foundation of people knowing instinctively not to approach him, to give him the isolation he'd craved since tragedy had carved out his insides and left only hunger for control. Yet this child with the red nose and impossibly large eyes had walked right up to his carefully constructed fortress and announced Santa's failure, as if Vigo might somehow have answers. "You're waiting for the 47 bus." The boy stated this as fact, rather than question, settling onto the bench with the exhausted posture of someone far too familiar with waiting in uncomfortable places. He didn't ask permission to share Vigo's deliberately isolated space, simply accepted the bench as communal property, the way children did before the world taught them about boundaries and fear. Vigo found himself nodding before his brain caught up to the gesture, breaking his own rule about engaging with complications that didn't serve immediate strategic purpose. The 47 bus had been his escape route from this sector for 3 months now, ever since his usual driver had started asking questions about destinations that didn't fit the pattern of a man who supposedly spent his evenings in penthouse towers. Coming to this forgotten corner had been about maintaining secrets, about having one piece of existence that remained unobserved. "It's not coming tonight." Jude pulled out a battered phone with a cracked screen, the kind of device that still functioned despite obvious damage through sheer determination. His small fingers navigated the bus tracking app with practiced efficiency that spoke to how often he performed this ritual, how many nights he'd spent monitoring transportation that connected him to someone important. The screen showed cancellations in red text, holiday service suspensions that had clearly ambushed the child's carefully laid plans. The wind picked up with the particular cruelty December saved for those without proper shelter, and Vigo watched the boy pull that inadequate sweater tighter across his chest, in a gesture that accomplished nothing practical. 2 blocks away, the festival reached its evening crescendo with music that drifted on the same wind, currently cutting through insufficient clothing. The contrast between that warmth and this isolation felt deliberate, as if the city itself had drawn a line between those who belonged to Christmas and those who merely observed it. "My birthday was last week." Jude offered this information the way children did, without clear connection to previous conversation, but with absolute certainty of its importance. He swung his legs back and forth, sneakers not quite reaching the ground, a rhythm that suggested this bench had become familiar territory rather than temporary stop. The backpack shifted with his movement, and Vigo caught a glimpse of something wrapped in aluminum foil, edges carefully pressed down to preserve whatever lay beneath. Vigo's espresso had gone cold in its cup, expensive coffee wasted because he'd been too lost in thoughts he shouldn't have been thinking to remember its existence. He'd purchased it from the corner cafe 3 blocks back purely out of habit, the ritual of holding something warm more important than actually consuming it. Now it sat between them like his original intention for this evening, abandoned and forgotten. "I turned 6. Jude continued his one-sided conversation with the ease of a child accustomed to filling silences that adults created. His breath formed small clouds in the freezing air, and he watched them dissipate with the fascination of someone who found wonder in ordinary physics. The streetlight above them flickered with electrical inconsistency, creating shadows that danced across the boy's features and made him look even younger than his announced age. Vigo should have stood up, walked away, flagged down one of the taxis that occasionally passed through this forgotten sector, despite the slim chances of profitable fares. He'd built his entire adult life on the principle of strategic disconnection, of never allowing sentiment to compromise the mathematical precision with which he navigated a world that punished weakness. Every instinct he'd honed over 15 years of calculated survival screamed that this child represented exactly the kind of complication that destroyed carefully maintained control. "Mama made me a cake." Jude's voice carried pride mixed with something that might have been disappointment, though he tried to hide it behind the determined cheerfulness of children who'd learned early not to burden adults with complaints. He patted his backpack with one small hand, and the aluminum foil crinkled with the sound of something that had probably been beautiful once. The bus stop's plastic shelter did almost nothing to block the wind that kept finding new ways to remind them both that comfort was a privilege neither currently possessed. It melted on the earlier bus. The admission came quietly, as if Jude felt personally responsible for the cake's transformation, despite having no control over temperature or transportation timing. He unzipped the backpack just enough for Vigo to see the collapsed remains of what had probably been a vanilla cake, the kind made with whatever ingredients stretched furthest in a budget that didn't allow for bakery luxuries. The frosting had separated into a glossy pool that no longer resembled its original intention. Vigo recognized the watch on his own wrist cost more than this child's family probably spent on groceries in 6 months, maybe longer. The Italian leather of his shoes whispered about handcrafted luxury with every slight movement, and the coat keeping him warm against December's assault carried a designer label that most people in this sector wouldn't recognize. He existed in a parallel universe where melted birthday cakes didn't happen because money insulated against such small tragedies. Yet here, he sat sharing a broken bench with living proof that his world wasn't the only one that mattered. "Are you sad?" Jude asked the question with the directness that made adults uncomfortable, the kind of emotional inquiry that violated unspoken rules about what strangers discussed at bus stops. His enormous eyes studied Vigo's face with an intensity that suggested he actually cared about the answer, that this wasn't polite conversation, but genuine curiosity about the internal landscape of a man who'd forgotten anyone might wonder. The backpack sat between them like a border neither had explicitly agreed to respect. Vigo's throat tightened with a response he had no intention of voicing, words that would crack open carefully sealed compartments where he stored feelings that served no productive purpose. He'd trained himself not to answer questions like this, to deflect and redirect until people stopped asking, stopped looking at him like he might be human underneath the armor. But something about the way this child waited for his response, patient and unhurried despite the cold, made his usual evasions feel heavier than honesty. Sometimes, the admission escaped before he could stop it, single word that violated years of disciplined silence about anything resembling vulnerability. Jude nodded as if Vigo had just confirmed something he'd already suspected, as if sadness was a language this 6-year-old spoke fluently enough to recognize in strangers at frozen bus stops. The snow fell harder, accumulating on their shoulders and the bench between them, building small drifts that neither bothered to brush away. "Mama says everyone gets sad sometimes, even people with fancy watches." Jude delivered this observation with the matter-of-fact tone of someone repeating wisdom he'd heard often enough to believe. He kicked his legs harder, sneakers creating their own rhythm against the cold air, and Vigo found himself watching the movement instead of the empty street where no bus would arrive. The festival music swelled 2 blocks away, reaching its peak with the kind of joy that felt almost aggressive in its insistence that everyone should be celebrating. The cold had started penetrating even Vigo's expensive coat, the kind of deep chill that no amount of quality fabric could ultimately defeat when combined with stillness and time. He noticed Jude's shivering had intensified, small tremors running through the boy's frame that he tried to hide by pressing closer to his backpack. The plastic shelter above them rattled with each gust of wind, threatening to tear loose from moorings that looked as temporary as everything else in this forgotten corner. "You're waiting for your mother," Vigo heard himself say, statement rather than question, piecing together the puzzle of why a 6-year-old would be alone at a bus stop on Christmas Eve with a melted birthday cake. The boy's face brightened with the particular joy children showed when adults correctly guessed something important, validation that their lives made sense to someone beyond themselves. Jude nodded enthusiastically, and drops of melted snow fell from his hair onto his inadequate sweater, adding dampness to the list of discomforts he was enduring. "She works the night cleaning at the hospital on Mercy Street." Jude shared this information with the same pride he'd shown about his birthday, as if his mother's employment deserved recognition, regardless of its prestige or compensation. He explained that she always took the 47 bus home after her shift ended, that he liked to meet her so they could ride back together through the decorated streets. The tradition had apparently started months ago, this ritual of connection that turned a simple commute into shared experience. Vigo knew Mercy Street Hospital, had driven past it countless times without really seeing it, the kind of facility that served populations his world rarely intersected with despite geographic proximity. The night cleaning staff would be invisible labor, people who maintained spaces while others slept, whose existence barely registered in the consciousness of those who benefited from their work. That this woman worked Christmas Eve while her son waited at frozen bus stops created a heaviness in his chest that felt dangerously close to the emotions he'd successfully avoided for years. "She doesn't know I come here." Jude confessed this with a slight wince, aware he was admitting to disobedience, but trusting Vigo somehow with the secret. He explained that his mother thought he stayed with Mrs. Chen downstairs, but Mrs. Chen had fallen asleep early, and Jude had slipped out because riding the bus together was his favorite part of Christmas. The logic was pure childhood reasoning, where the joy of surprise outweighed considerations of safety or parental panic. The streetlight flickered again, and for a moment died completely, plunging them into darkness interrupted only by the distant glow of festival lights that felt like they belonged to another dimension. When it sputtered back to life, Vigo saw that Jude had moved slightly closer, the backpack barrier less absolute than before. The boy's nose had gone from red to an alarming shade that suggested frostbite might become a genuine concern if the situation continued much longer. Vigo pulled out his phone with hands that had handled weapons and signed documents worth millions, but now hesitated over a simple weather app. The temperature had dropped 5 degrees in the last hour, and the forecast showed it plummeting further as the night progressed. Snow accumulation warnings blinked in orange text, suggesting people seek shelter and avoid unnecessary travel. The irony of that advice wasn't lost on him as he sat at an exposed bus stop with a 6-year-old who'd snuck out to surprise his mother. "That's a really nice phone," Jude observed, his earlier directness extending to material possessions with the same lack of filter he'd shown about emotions. He asked if it could play games, if Vigo had pictures of his family, if the screen ever cracked like his mother's phone. The questions tumbled out with the breathless quality of someone who'd been quiet as long as politeness required and now felt permission to speak freely. Vigo found himself turning the phone so Jude could see the screen, showing him the weather app, even though the information it displayed was hardly appropriate for sharing with a child already too cold. But Jude studied the numbers and graphics with serious attention, his small brow furrowing in concentration. He announced that his mother would be worried when she didn't find him at home, but that the surprise would be worth it once she understood his reasoning. The wind carried voices from the festival, laughter and music intertwining with the smell of roasted chestnuts and mulled wine that made the air itself seem warmer 2 blocks away. Here in their isolated corner, those sounds felt like broadcasts from a world that had forgotten this particular bus stop existed. Vigo wondered how many other forgotten corners the city contained, how many people spent Christmas Eve in spaces that celebration never reached. "Do you have a family?" Jude asked, returning to his earlier pattern of questions that violated the comfortable distance Vigo maintained between himself and personal inquiry. The boy had pulled his sleeves down over his hands in a futile attempt to create warmth where fabric didn't extend, and the gesture reminded Vigo of someone else from a lifetime ago, a memory he'd buried so deep that its unexpected surfacing felt like physical pain. Vigo's no came out harder than he intended, single syllable that shut down conversation with the efficiency of a door slamming. But Jude didn't flinch or retreat, simply accepted the answer, and moved on to wondering aloud whether Vigo liked hot chocolate, whether he'd ever built a snowman, whether he thought the 47 bus might come after all if they waited long enough. The resilience in the face of his curtness felt like a rebuke to every wall he'd ever constructed. The espresso cup sat forgotten on the bench, now filled with snow that was slowly burying it, like evidence of a life Vigo had intended to live tonight, before a 6-year-old interrupted with announcements about Santa's forgetfulness. He'd come to this sector to think, to escape the suffocating expectations of the Christmas party his associates were undoubtedly attending without him, their absence of questions a courtesy bought through years of establishing boundaries. This bus stop had become his refuge from a world that demanded constant performance of power he no longer felt certain he possessed. "Why are you here if you don't have family to celebrate with?" Jude's question carried no judgment, only the genuine confusion of someone whose entire understanding of holidays centered on being together with people you loved. He swung his legs faster, generating movement that might have created warmth through friction if physics worked that way. His backpack had shifted during the conversation, and now the melted cake was visible through the partially open zipper, a collapsed architecture of someone's best effort with limited resources. Vigo could have offered a dozen practiced lies, the kind of smooth deflections that had become second nature over 15 years of living a double life. But something about this child's unfiltered honesty made deception feel heavier than truth, made the usual evasions seem like betrayals of an authenticity he'd forgotten could exist between strangers. He found himself explaining that being alone was a choice, that he preferred silence to the performance required by celebration. That sounds really sad, though. Jude delivered this assessment with the blunt compassion of childhood, seeing through sophisticated rationalizations to the emotional reality underneath. He asked if Vigo had friends, if anyone would miss him if he disappeared, if he'd ever received birthday cakes that melted on buses. The questions weren't cruel but curious, attempting to map the terrain of an adult loneliness he didn't yet have frameworks to fully comprehend. The festival music shifted to something slower, a carol about comfort and joy that felt deliberately ironic given their current circumstances. Vigo watched Jude's shivering increase and made a calculation that had nothing to do with strategic advantage and everything to do with the basic human inability to watch a child freeze. He stood abruptly, his expensive coat shedding accumulated snow, and the movement caught Jude's attention with the startled alertness of someone accustomed to sudden changes mattering. "My car is warmer than this bench." The offer came out more like a command. Years of giving orders, making suggestions sound like decree. Vigo gestured toward the black Mercedes parked in the shadows 30 feet away, the kind of vehicle that cost more than most people earned in years. He watched Jude's eyes widen with recognition that this stranger possessed resources far beyond bus fare, watched the child's internal debate play out across features too young to have mastered concealment. Jude hesitated with the caution his mother had probably drilled into him about strangers and cars, warnings that took on extra weight when the stranger looked like Vigo, and the car screamed wealth that normal people didn't casually park in forgotten sectors. But the cold was making decisions that comfort could rationalize away, and the promise of heat pulled stronger than maternal warnings designed for different circumstances. He clutched his backpack tighter, nodded slowly, and slid off the bench with trust that felt simultaneously innocent and terrifying. The Mercedes chirped as Vigo unlocked it, sound that seemed too cheerful for the weight of what was happening. He opened the passenger door and watched Jude climb into leather seats that probably cost more than the boy's entire wardrobe. Watched small hands explore heated surfaces with the wonder of someone discovering technology that existed only in imagination. The interior smelled of expensive cologne and new car scent, artificial environments that bore no relationship to melted birthday cakes or inadequate sweaters. Vigo started the engine and turned the heat to maximum, watching the dashboard display numbers that promised rapid warming to temperatures that might actually preserve human fingers and toes. Jude pressed his reddened hands against the heating vents with a sigh of relief that sounded decades older than 6 years, and the backpack settled on his lap like a security blanket he wouldn't release even in improved circumstances. The windows fogged immediately from the temperature differential, creating a cocoon that isolated them further from the frozen world outside. "This is really nice." Jude's voice carried awe mixed with the slightly guilty pleasure of experiencing luxury he hadn't earned and probably didn't deserve according to whatever calculus children use to measure fairness. He asked about the dashboard screens, the buttons that controlled mysterious functions, whether the seats could really heat up, or if that was just magic disguised as technology. His fingers traced the leather stitching with reverence usually reserved for art museums. Vigo found himself explaining functions he'd never thought about explaining, pointing out features he'd taken for granted since purchasing this vehicle as casual transportation between more important destinations. The heated seats, the climate control, the entertainment system that could play any song ever recorded. Jude absorbed this information with the intensity of someone cataloging details to share later, creating memories from an experience he recognized as outside his normal existence. "Do you drive this every day?" The question contained worlds of assumption about Vigo's life, about resources and choices, and the kind of existence where expensive cars were tools rather than aspirations. Jude explained that he and his mother took the bus everywhere, that she'd been saving for a car, but something always came up that needed the money more urgently. The matter-of-fact delivery suggested this wasn't complaint, but simply reality, the way things worked in a world where transportation depended on schedules made by others. The warmth had begun penetrating Vigo's own cold, thawing fingers he hadn't realized had gone numb during his vigil on the frozen bench. He'd intended tonight as an exercise in controlled isolation, a few hours of voluntary discomfort that would somehow justify the excessive comfort of the rest of his existence. Instead, He'd encountered a child whose discomfort wasn't voluntary or meaningful, just the practical consequence of poverty meeting December's cruelty. "Where do you live?" Vigo asked this before thinking through implications, before considering that knowing addresses created connections he'd spent years avoiding. But Jude answered without hesitation, reciting street names and building numbers with the pride of someone who had an address at all. 2 miles from here, in a sector Vigo knew peripherally as the kind of neighborhood where his organization collected debts but never invested in improvements. The boy's description of his building included details about Mrs. Chen's apartment on the first floor, about the broken elevator that made his mother tired from climbing stairs after night shifts, about the window that looked out onto a fire escape where pigeons nested every spring. The mundane specificity painted a picture of life Vigo had intellectually known existed, but never really considered, in terms of actual human beings with birthday cakes and Christmas traditions. "My mama will be looking for me soon." Jude checked his cracked phone screen with the worried expression of someone realizing good intentions might have consequences he hadn't fully thought through. He explained that her shift ended in 40 minutes, that she'd go straight to Mrs. Chen's apartment and discover his absence. The panic in his voice was fresh, the kind that came from suddenly understanding that surprise and worry weren't as different as he'd assumed. Vigo made a decision that violated approximately 17 different personal rules about involvement and exposure, about maintaining separation between his public life and whatever this frozen evening had become. He shifted the Mercedes into drive with the smooth precision of German engineering and asked for the specific address with a tone that suggested this was routine rather than revolutionary. Jude's relieved expression made something twist uncomfortably in Vigo's chest, some long-dormant instinct he'd thought successfully excised. The car pulled away from the bus stop smoothly, leaving behind the forgotten corner and the cold espresso and the plastic bench that had witnessed their unlikely meeting. Through the fogged windows, the festival lights became blurred halos of color that painted the snow in shades Vigo hadn't bothered to notice when he'd walked past them earlier. Jude pressed his face against the glass with renewed energy, narrating their route through streets he knew from bus windows, pointing out landmarks that mattered only to someone whose world was measured in walking distances and public transportation schedules. The apartment building materialized from the snow, like something that had barely survived whatever architectural assault had created it. 5 stories of brick and wishful thinking that probably violated current safety codes. Vigo parked the Mercedes in a loading zone that no one would ticket because his plates carried implications even traffic enforcement recognized, and the contrast between vehicle and building felt almost obscene. Paint peeled from the entrance door in strips that revealed at least 3 previous color choices, and the intercom system hung partially detached from the wall, with wires exposed like failed surgery. Jude had barely opened his door when a figure burst through the building's entrance with the explosive energy of panic achieving physical form. The woman was younger than Vigo had expected, mid-20s at most, with blonde hair pulled back in a ponytail that had partly escaped during what must have been frantic searching. Her work uniform was visible under a coat she'd clearly grabbed without buttoning, and her face showed the particular terror of mothers who'd discovered their children missing. Jude. The name came out half scream and half sob, and Maeva covered the distance between building and car with speed that ignored ice and snow and any consideration of her own safety. She reached the Mercedes just as Jude climbed out, and her hands were on him immediately, checking for injuries or signs of harm with the systematic intensity of someone who'd imagined every possible disaster in the minutes since discovering his absence. Her eyes hadn't yet registered Vigo's existence, focused entirely on the small body she was cataloging for damage. Vigo stepped out of the driver's side slowly, deliberately making his movements visible and non-threatening, aware that his appearance from this expensive car with her missing child probably triggered every maternal warning system evolution had installed. He kept his hands visible and his expression neutral, falling back on the particular stillness he'd learned to project when situations required de-escalation. The snow fell between them like static interference, and he watched her attention finally shift from Jude to the man who'd delivered him. Maeva's eyes widened with recognition that had nothing to do with personal familiarity, and everything to do with the expensive coat, the car, the particular quality of threat that men like Vigo carried regardless of actual intention. She positioned herself between Jude and this stranger with instinct faster than thought, one arm pulling her son behind her while the other hand reached for the phone Vigo could see protruding from her coat pocket. Her breathing had gone shallow and rapid, adrenaline preparing her body for confrontation, despite obvious disadvantages in any physical contest. The buses weren't running. Vigo offered this explanation before she could speak, keeping his voice level and his posture open in ways that felt unnatural after years of using intimidation as primary communication tool. He gestured back toward where they'd come from, toward the forgotten corner now invisible through snow and distance. Jude peeked around his mother's protective stance, adding his own rapid-fire explanation about waiting at the bus stop and how the nice man had let him warm up in his car. The nice man. Vigo almost laughed at the descriptor, at how poorly it fit someone whose business cards carried titles that meant something very different to people who understood the city's real power structures. But Maeva's expression hadn't softened, her assessment taking in details that told stories about wealth and danger, and the kind of men who didn't simply help children out of generosity. Her grip on Jude tightened, even as her son continued his enthusiastic testimony about heated seats and dashboard computers. "Why were you at that bus stop?" Maeva's question cut through Jude's chatter with the sharpness of someone who'd learned not to trust convenient coincidences. Her voice carried exhaustion underneath the fear, the bone-deep weariness of someone who'd just worked a night shift and then experienced every parent's nightmare in concentrated form. But underneath the exhaustion lived steel, the kind of strength that came from surviving circumstances that would have broken softer people. Vigo recognized the impossibility of answering honestly, of explaining that he'd been hiding from his own life at a forgotten bus stop when her son had appeared with announcements about Santa's failures. The truth sounded more suspicious than comfortable lies, made him seem stranger than if he'd simply claimed to be passing through. But something about her direct gaze made deflection feel cowardly, made him want to offer truth, even if it damned him further in her assessment. "I go there sometimes to think." The admission came out rougher than intended, and Vigo watched her process this non-answer that revealed more than explanation would have. Her eyes narrowed slightly, trying to reconcile expensive clothes and luxury vehicles with voluntary isolation in frozen corners that normal people avoided. Jude had started shivering again, despite the recent warmth, and this practical concern created visible conflict on Maeva's face between suspicion and the undeniable fact that Vigo had returned her child safely. The building's door opened again, and an elderly Asian woman appeared, calling Maeva's name with the urgent concern of someone who'd been part of the search. Mrs. Chen's appearance seemed to validate some of Jude's story, and her rapid questions in accented English about where he'd been and whether he was hurt created a chorus that made further conversation difficult. Maeva's attention divided between Vigo and Mrs. Chen, between threat assessment and community obligation. "Thank you for bringing him home." Maeva delivered this with the particular tone people used when gratitude fought resentment, when being indebted to strangers felt dangerous regardless of outcome. She pulled Jude closer, preparing to retreat into the building's relative safety, to put walls between her family and whatever complication this man represented. Her ponytail had come completely loose during the panic, and blonde hair fell around her face in ways that made her look even younger and more exhausted. Vigo nodded acknowledgement and turned back toward the Mercedes, telling himself this was the appropriate ending, that delivering the child safely completed any obligation the evening had created. But his hand paused on the car door when he noticed the building's entrance, noticed how the broken intercom sparked intermittently, how ice had formed on the steps from water that leaked somewhere in the infrastructure. Details he wouldn't normally register suddenly felt significant, felt like warnings about conditions a 6-year-old shouldn't endure. "Your building's heating system," Vigo heard himself say before the thought fully formed, breaking his own retreat toward appropriate boundaries. He turned back to find Maeva's expression had shifted from relief to confusion, uncertain why this stranger was still talking, or what heating systems had to do with anything. Mrs. Chen had taken Jude's hand and was leading him toward the door, but both mother and son paused at Vigo's words. Maeva's face changed as she processed what he was implying, recognition that someone who drove a Mercedes and wore clothes like that would notice things like broken heating in buildings like hers. Her spine straightened with the particular pride people showed when outsiders observed their poverty, when circumstances they couldn't control became visible to those who'd never struggled. She confirmed the system had been broken for 2 weeks, that the landlord kept promising repairs that never materialized. "I know people." Vigo's offer came wrapped in the vague phrasing he'd perfected for situations where specificity would raise questions he didn't want to answer. He explained that building systems were surprisingly simple to fix when the right pressure got applied to the right people, that a heating system on Christmas Eve constituted emergency circumstances that even negligent landlords could be motivated to address. His tone suggested this was casual rather than significant, just information she could use or ignore. Maeva's expression cycled through emotions faster than Vigo could catalog them. Suspicion and hope and pride warring across features that showed every impact of the night's accumulated stress. She asked what it would cost, what he would expect in return. The practical questions of someone who'd learned that help always came with price tags, whether stated explicitly or hidden in small print. Her hand had moved to Jude's shoulder, protective gesture that reminded both of them she had someone more important than pride to consider. Nothing. The word felt foreign in Vigo's mouth, concept he didn't traffic in professionally where every transaction had calculated value and explicit terms. But he found himself repeating it, adding that no 6-year-old should spend Christmas Eve in a building without heat, that this was just basic human decency, rather than transaction. The phrase felt strange coming from someone whose business operated explicitly outside human decency's boundaries. Jude had started pulling his mother toward the building, excited chatter about the warm car, and the nice man creating a narrative Vigo barely recognized as accurate. Maeva allowed herself to be pulled, but her eyes never left Vigo's face, still searching for the catch she was certain existed. Mrs. Chen had gone back inside, probably to spread news of the drama, and snow had begun covering the Mercedes in a white blanket that would require clearing before Vigo could drive away. Why would you do that? Maeva's question carried the exhaustion of someone too tired to maintain defensive walls, genuine confusion breaking through practiced suspicion. Her shift had clearly been long, the kind of physically demanding work that left people hollowed out, and discovering Jude's absence had spent whatever reserves she'd been running on. Now she stood in the snow with a stranger offering help she desperately needed but couldn't trust, trying to make decisions with a mind that had stopped functioning optimally hours ago. Vigo didn't have an answer that would satisfy either of them. No explanation for why a child's announcement about Santa's forgetfulness had derailed his entire evening and apparently convinced him to involve himself in situations he'd spent 15 years avoiding. He settled for shrugging, gesture that communicated uncertainty rather than dismissal, acknowledging he didn't fully understand his own motivations. The wind picked up again, and Maeva shivered in her unbuttoned coat, making the conversation feel cruel in its extension. Go inside before you freeze. Before you... Vigo made it sound like command rather than concern, falling back on authoritative tone because gentleness felt too exposed. He promised to make calls about the heating, said it would be fixed within hours if his people did their jobs correctly. Maeva nodded slowly, pulling Jude finally toward the building's entrance, but she looked back twice before disappearing inside, expression unreadable in the combination of streetlight and snow that made everything slightly surreal. Vigo stood alone beside the Mercedes as the building door closed, watching lights appear in windows on the 3rd floor that were probably Maeva's apartment. The festival music had faded to silence or distance, and this sector of the city felt abandoned in ways that made his earlier isolation seem self-indulgent rather than meaningful. He pulled out his phone and made 3 calls that would wake people who wouldn't dare complain about the hour, conversations that involved very specific instructions about heating systems and consequences of failure to deliver. The superintendent's voice on Vigo's phone carried the particular nervousness of men who recognize danger, even through digital distance, stammering assurances that the heating system would be operational within 2 hours maximum. Vigo ended the call without pleasantries and watched his breath form clouds that dissolved into December's relentless assault. The Mercedes had accumulated enough snow that his reflection in the window had become ghostly, a distorted version of someone he barely recognized making promises to strangers about heating systems. He should have driven away immediately after that final call, returned to the penthouse that waited in the city's expensive center, with temperature-controlled perfection and the kind of isolation that money guaranteed. But his hands remained still on the steering wheel, engine running but gear shift untouched, some gravitational force keeping him anchored to this spot, outside a building that represented everything his world had trained him to ignore. The 3rd-floor windows glowed with warm yellow light that seemed impossibly distant despite being only 50 feet away. Vigo's phone buzzed with messages from his second-in-command, questions about tomorrow's meeting that required decisions only he could make about territories and percentages, and the mathematical violence his organization practiced. He typed responses with thumbs that had gone stiff from cold, maintaining the persona of control that his position demanded even while sitting in a car outside an apartment building for reasons he couldn't articulate. The contrast between those messages and this moment felt like living in parallel universes that shouldn't have any points of connection. 20 minutes passed before the building's door opened again, and Maeva emerged alone, coat now properly buttoned, but her expression still carrying the fractured quality of someone whose evening had contained too many emotional whiplash moments. She approached the Mercedes with visible hesitation, and Vigo lowered the passenger window to let in air cold enough to make his lungs ache. Her face appeared in the opening, blonde hair now properly secured again, and her eyes had shifted from suspicious to something more complicated. The heat came back on. Maeva delivered this news like an accusation and a question simultaneously, as if the speed of the repair had confirmed suspicions about exactly what kind of man could make broken systems function with simple phone calls. She asked how he'd managed it, what threats or payments had motivated a landlord who'd ignored 2 weeks of complaints. Her tone suggested she wasn't certain she wanted the answers, that knowing might create obligations she couldn't afford. Vigo considered lying, offering some vague explanation about knowing the right people to call, but her directness demanded reciprocal honesty, even when truth was complicated. He told her simply that everyone responded to appropriate motivation, that landlords had pressure points like anyone else, that sometimes all it took was someone willing to apply force to the right leverage points. The explanation revealed more about his capabilities than was probably wise, but something about this woman made calculated deception feel more dangerous than disclosure. "Jude won't stop talking about you." Maeva's statement came with the exhausted fondness of mothers dealing with children who'd latched onto ideas that wouldn't dislodge easily. She explained he'd narrated the entire car ride in elaborate detail to Mrs. Chen, transformed the stranger at the bus stop into something approaching heroic through the particular alchemy of 6-year-old interpretation. Her expression suggested she wasn't entirely comfortable with her son's enthusiasm about a man who drove luxury vehicles and fixed heating systems through mysterious phone calls. The wind had died down temporarily, creating a pocket of stillness that made their conversation feel more intimate than Vigo preferred. He could see the exhaustion etched around Maeva's eyes, the particular weariness that came from physical labor combined with emotional crisis. Her hands gripped the window frame and he noticed scarring on her knuckles, old injuries that suggested history he had no right to inquire about. She was studying him with the same intensity Jude had shown, different assessment but equal directness. "He wants to thank you properly." Maeva delivered this with the tone of someone extending invitations they half-hoped would be declined. She explained Jude had insisted she come down to ask if Vigo wanted to come upstairs for coffee, that her son felt the evening's conclusion had been incomplete without proper gratitude. The offer hung between them like something fragile, easily shattered by refusal, but potentially dangerous if accepted. Vigo's immediate instinct was decline, to activate the smooth evasion tactics that had protected him from exactly these kinds of entanglements for 15 years. But his mouth formed acceptance before his brain finished crafting polite refusal, some part of him apparently having made decisions his conscious mind hadn't yet authorized. He watched surprise flash across Maeva's face, followed quickly by what might have been regret that he'd called her bluff, that now she'd have to follow through on an invitation she'd probably expected him to refuse. The building's interior hallway smelled of cooking and humanity, the particular scent of spaces where multiple families lived in close proximity with varying definitions of ventilation. Christmas decorations hung sporadically, paper snowflakes and strings of lights that must have been older than Jude, creating cheer through determination rather than resources. The elevator doors stood open to reveal an out-of-order sign, and Maeva gestured toward stairs that looked like they'd been climbed by generations of tired feet. Vigo followed her up 3 flights, his expensive shoes creating sounds that seemed too loud against the worn treads, announcing his presence to anyone paying attention. He noticed the railing wobbled under his hand, that water stains marked the ceiling in patterns suggesting chronic leaks, that the recently restored heat was uneven at best. Each floor's hallway showed slight variations on the same theme of maintenance deferred, of a building surviving through stubborn refusal to completely collapse. Maeva's apartment door was third on the left, marked with a crooked number 3 and a small drawing that was clearly Jude's work, some kind of dinosaur rendered in crayon. She hesitated with her key in the lock, and Vigo recognized the vulnerability of letting a stranger into the space that contained everything she owned, everything that mattered. He kept his expression neutral, his posture non-threatening, giving her time to change her mind about this invitation that circumstance had forced into being. The apartment was smaller than Vigo's master bathroom, every inch serving multiple purposes with the efficiency of people who'd learned to make limited space function. A couch that probably converted to a bed occupied most of the living area, and a kitchen barely large enough for one person opened directly onto the main room. But it was clean, with the kind of cleanliness that required constant effort, and decorated with the careful touches of someone who believed home should feel intentional, even when resources were limited. Jude exploded from what must have been a bedroom with renewed energy, his earlier cold apparently forgotten in excitement about the visitor who'd materialized in his actual home. He'd changed into pajamas decorated with dinosaurs that matched the door drawing, and his enthusiasm filled the small space with noise that made Vigo acutely aware of how quiet his own penthouse always remained. Mrs. Chen appeared behind the boy, and Maeva thanked her in a tone that suggested this elderly neighbor had provided countless hours of childcare that official payment could never compensate. Mrs. Chen left with pointed glances at Vigo that communicated she'd noticed everything about him worth noticing and would be available immediately if needed. The door closed, and suddenly the apartment felt even smaller, 3 people in a space designed for economy rather than comfort. Maeva moved toward the kitchen with the automatic movements of someone whose hospitality instincts operated even through exhaustion, starting coffee preparations while Jude pulled Vigo toward the couch with insistent small hands. The boy wanted to show him everything: toys organized in a plastic bin that served as both storage and table, books worn soft from repeated reading, a drawing of his mother that captured her smile with more accuracy than skilled artists sometimes managed. Vigo found himself sitting on a couch covered in a blanket that hid worn upholstery, listening to a 6-year-old's narration of his entire life with the breathless enthusiasm of someone who believed every detail mattered equally. The melted birthday cake had been placed carefully in the small refrigerator, rescued from complete loss. Maeva returned with coffee in mismatched mugs that were probably the only ones she owned, and Vigo accepted his with hands that had signed death sentences, but now handled ceramic decorated with faded flowers. The coffee was stronger than the expensive espresso he'd abandoned at the bus stop, made with the careful attention of someone who couldn't afford to waste even cheap beans. She sat in the only chair, leaving the couch to him and Jude, maintaining physical distance even in the enforced proximity of limited space. He should be in bed. Maeva directed this at her son with the exhausted authority of someone who'd already fought this battle and knew she'd lost. Jude protested with the vigor of children who sensed adult rules were more flexible than usual due to extraordinary circumstances. He wanted to tell Vigo about his school, about his favorite dinosaur, about the snow fort he planned to build if it ever stopped falling. Each topic led to 3 more in the associative logic of childhood conversation. Vigo surprised himself by asking questions instead of checking his phone, by genuinely listening to answers about Triceratops versus Tyrannosaurus Rex, as if this information might actually matter in his world. He noticed Maeva watching this interaction with an expression he couldn't quite read, some combination of wariness and something softer that she tried to hide behind her coffee mug. The apartment's heat was working now, filling the small space with warmth that made the earlier cold seem like it had happened to different people in a different lifetime. The conversation eventually wound down as Jude's energy finally met its limit, his words starting to slur with approaching sleep. Maeva stood to carry him to the bedroom, and Vigo saw how practiced this motion was, how many times she'd performed this exact transfer of deadweight child. She returned a few minutes later, and settled back in her chair, with a sigh that seemed to release every tension the evening had accumulated, finally allowing herself to acknowledge exhaustion now that her child was safe and warm. The silence between them felt different than the silence at the bus stop, weighted with awareness that they were alone now, in a space that held all of Maeva's vulnerabilities on display. Vigo noticed details that spoke to careful resource management, the way soap had been cut into smaller pieces to extend its life, how the kitchen towels showed precise darning that had extended their usefulness years beyond normal life expectancy. These weren't the observations of someone looking for weakness, but of someone finally seeing reality he'd spent 15 years avoiding. You didn't have to stay. Maeva's voice carried the particular exhaustion that made people say true things they'd normally keep hidden. She explained she'd expected him to make polite excuses after the first 5 minutes, that men who drove cars like his didn't usually sit through children's dinosaur lectures in apartments barely larger than closets. Her fingers traced the rim of her coffee mug in repetitive patterns that suggested this was how she self-soothed when stress exceeded manageable levels. Vigo found himself telling her about the espresso at the bus stop, about choosing frozen isolation over the Christmas party, where his absence would be noted but not questioned. He explained in vague terms about a life built on control that sometimes felt like imprisonment, about how wealth created different kinds of cold that central heating couldn't fix. The admission surprised him with its honesty, revealing vulnerabilities he'd successfully hidden from people who'd known him for years. Maeva listened without interrupting, her expression shifting from suspicious to something approaching understanding as he talked. She asked if he had family, the same question Jude had posed, but weighted differently coming from someone who understood adult loss. Vigo's no came easier this time, followed by fragments about a fire 16 years ago that had taken everyone who'd mattered, about building an empire from the insurance money, and survivor's guilt that had never quite faded into something manageable. "I'm sorry." Mava delivered this with the simple sincerity of someone who understood that loss didn't diminish with time or money, that some absences remained permanent regardless of what you built to fill the space. She shared her own story in return, about Jude's father who'd disappeared before their son was born, about dreams of nursing school that had dissolved when single motherhood arrived with all its practical demands. Her tone carried no self-pity, just the matter-of-fact recitation of how life actually worked, versus how she'd once imagined it might. The conversation revealed parallel loneliness in vastly different circumstances, isolation that looked nothing alike but felt surprisingly similar in its core essence. Vigo learned she worked night shifts at Mercy Street Hospital, cleaning operating rooms and patient floors, work that paid barely enough to cover rent and food with nothing left for emergencies or futures. She'd been 22 when Jude was born, had spent 6 years constructing a life from determination and careful calculations that one unexpected expense could destroy completely. "Why do you go to that bus stop?" Mava circled back to her earlier question, pressing for the truth he'd avoided with Jude's innocent inquiry. Her directness reminded him of her son's unfiltered approach to conversation, genetic inheritance of refusing to accept evasion as acceptable response. The apartment's heat made the space feel almost too warm now, or maybe that sensation came from the discomfort of being seen more clearly than he'd allowed in years. Vigo explained about needing spaces that existed outside his normal life, about how the forgotten corner let him be someone other than the role his organization demanded. He didn't specify what that organization did, but Mava's expression suggested she'd already formed conclusions about men who fixed heating systems with phone calls and drove vehicles that cost more than she'd earn in 5 years. Her next question confirmed this assessment, asking directly if he was dangerous in ways that should make her reconsider letting him into her home. Yes. The honesty felt like removing armor, acknowledging truth that politeness usually camouflaged behind euphemism and implication. Vigo added that he'd never hurt her or Jude, that whatever darkness defined his professional life had boundaries that children and their mothers remained safely beyond. He watched her process this confirmation, saw her weighing his words against his actions, trying to reconcile the man who'd returned her son safely with the implied violence of his admission. Mava surprised him by nodding slowly, as if dangerous honesty was preferable to safe lies. She explained she'd known since the heating repair that normal people didn't have access to that kind of immediate leverage, that his entire presence communicated power most people only encountered as victims. But she also noted he'd treated Jude with gentleness, that his actions contradicted the threat his resources implied. The assessment was clear-eyed and fair, acknowledging complexity rather than forcing him into simple categories of good or dangerous. Jude needs a father figure. Mava delivered this with the brutal honesty of someone too exhausted for subtlety. She explained her son had latched onto male teachers and neighbors, with the desperation of someone seeking a role model beyond his mother's capabilities to provide. She worried about what this hunger might make him vulnerable to, what kinds of men might exploit a 6-year-old's need for masculine attention and approval. The confession felt like a warning and a plea simultaneously. Vigo understood he was being asked to make a decision, to either establish clear boundaries or acknowledge that tonight had created connection that couldn't be easily dismissed. Every instinct trained by 15 years of strategic isolation demanded he stand up, thank her for the coffee, and exit this apartment along with the complications it represented. But his body remained seated on the worn couch, his coffee mug empty, but still held in hands that refused to release it and begin the departure process. I don't know how to be what he needs. The admission came quietly, acknowledging limitation that felt more vulnerable than confessing to danger. Vigo explained he had no template for healthy relationships, that the fire had taken his parents before he'd learned those lessons, that everything he'd built afterward had been about control and distance rather than connection. He was telling her he'd fail at whatever role she was asking him to consider, giving her the chance to rescind invitation before anyone got hurt. Mava's laugh surprised them both, exhausted sound that held more understanding than humor. She told him no one knew how to be what children needed, that parenting was mostly improvisation, and hoped that love covered the gaps where competence failed. She described her own constant fear of inadequacy, her terror that working night shifts meant abandoning Jude to television and neighbors during hours when better mothers provided direct attention. The shared confession of insufficiency created unexpected solidarity between their different kinds of failure. The conversation had shifted into territory neither had intended, vulnerability accumulating through admissions that built on each other until retreat felt more dishonest than continued exposure. Vigo found himself describing the penthouse he rarely spent time in, about how emptiness looked different when wrapped in expensive furniture and floor-to-ceiling windows. Maeva shared about budgets that never quite stretched to cover needs, about the particular shame of sending her child to school in clothes that didn't fit properly, because growth happened faster than paychecks allowed replacement. He talks about you like you're some kind of hero. Maeva's observation carried warning and curiosity equally weighted. She worried aloud about her son's tendency to idealize, to transform kindness into something larger than it was, because his world contained so little casual generosity. She asked if Vigo planned to disappear after tonight, if this was charity that would satisfy his conscience, and then fade into the category of nice things temporarily done. Her directness demanded equivalent honesty in response. Vigo realized he'd already made his decision, that sitting in this apartment drinking coffee from chipped mugs had been a choice that negated the option of clean departure. He told her he didn't know exactly what came next, but that driving away and forgetting tonight felt impossible in ways he couldn't fully articulate. The admission made him sound uncertain in ways bosses weren't supposed to be, vulnerable in ways his position normally prohibited. But the alternative was lying, and somehow that felt like greater betrayal than admitting confusion. Maeva studied his face with the intensity of someone making assessments that mattered beyond this moment, trying to determine if his uncertainty was honest or sophisticated manipulation. She asked what he actually wanted, what benefit he saw in involving himself with a cleaning woman and her 6-year-old son. The question carried the sharp edge of someone who'd learned to suspect generosity, to look for price tags hidden in gifts that appeared free. Her exhaustion had burned through politeness to something more raw and real. I don't know. Vigo's answer was truthful enough to be painful, acknowledging that he'd stumbled into this connection without strategy or clear objective. He explained that the bus stop had become refuge from a life that felt increasingly hollow despite its obvious success, that Jude's appearance had cracked something open that he'd thought permanently sealed. The explanation sounded inadequate even to his own ears, but it was the closest he could come to articulating motivations. He didn't fully understand himself. The apartment had grown warmer, the restored heating system working overtime to compensate for weeks of cold. Maeva's posture had softened incrementally during their conversation, the defensive tension easing into something more sustainable. She asked about his work in vague terms that suggested she didn't actually want specifics, preferring plausible deniability over confirmed knowledge. Vigo appreciated this courtesy, offering only that his business required moral flexibility that made conventional relationships complicated. Jude deserves better than complicated. Maeva stated this as fact rather than accusation, establishing baseline expectations for whatever arrangement might develop from tonight's unlikely intersection. She explained her son had already experienced enough instability that she wouldn't allow him to bond with someone who'd disappear when the novelty wore off, or when being involved stopped serving whatever purpose it currently served. The maternal ferocity in her voice reminded Vigo that exhaustion didn't equal weakness, that protectiveness could look soft but had steel underneath. 3 days passed before Vigo found himself parking the Mercedes outside Maeva's building again, this time in mid-afternoon when December light made the structure's disrepair visible in ways darkness had camouflaged. He'd spent those days attempting to focus on business that required his attention, signing documents and making decisions about territories and percentages, while his mind kept returning to a small apartment and conversations that had revealed more than was strategically wise. The distraction was unprecedented and deeply uncomfortable. He'd brought practical items disguised as leftovers, expensive prepared meals from restaurants his cook had ordered that Vigo claimed he'd never eat alone. The explanation was transparently false, but gave everyone plausible deniability, allowed Maeva to accept without admitting she needed help, and Vigo to provide without framing it as charity. He carried the bags up 3 flights of stairs, each step feeling simultaneously foreign and strangely natural, his expensive shoes creating familiar sounds against the worn treads. Maeva answered the door in casual clothes, day off evident in her more relaxed posture and the absence of work uniform. She looked younger without the exhaustion that night shifts carved into her features, though wariness still shadowed her expression when she registered the bags Vigo carried. He offered his rehearsed explanation about excess food and waste, watching her internal negotiation between pride and practicality play out across features that hadn't yet learned to hide these debates. Jude's squeal of recognition eliminated whatever resistance Maeva had been formulating, the boy barreling past his mother to wrap small arms around Vigo's legs, with the unself-conscious affection of children who hadn't learned yet to guard their enthusiasm. The physical contact created a moment of frozen surprise before Vigo's hand settled automatically on the child's head, awkward gesture that attempted to return the embrace without having any template for how such returns should function. Maeva watched this interaction with an expression he couldn't decipher. The afternoon unfolded with a rhythm that surprised Vigo with its easy normalcy, as if spending time in a cramped apartment watching cartoons while a 6-year-old provided running commentary was somehow part of his actual life. Jude had positioned himself against Vigo's shoulder within the first 15 minutes, the casual, physical proximity of someone who'd decided trust was warranted, regardless of adult reservations. Maeva prepared the food he'd brought with efficiency that suggested she'd been rationing her own meals, though she didn't comment on this directly. They ate at a small table that folded out from the wall, 3 people in a space really designed for 2, knees bumping and elbows requiring careful navigation. The food was restaurant quality, several levels above what this apartment normally contained, but Maeva had added her own touches that somehow made it feel more appropriate to the setting. She asked about Vigo's week in careful terms that avoided questions he couldn't answer honestly, constructing conversation that acknowledged boundaries while maintaining connection. Vigo found himself returning over the following weeks, visits that started as deliberate decisions, but gradually became something approaching routine. He'd appear with various excuses, items that needed homes or expertise he claimed they possessed, transparent justifications that everyone pretended to believe. Jude's excitement never diminished, each arrival treated as event worthy of celebration, while Maeva's wariness slowly transformed into something more complicated than simple acceptance. The boy had taken to falling asleep during their visits, exhausted by the excitement of having attention he craved but didn't regularly receive. Vigo would find himself with Jude's weight pressed against his side, small body radiating heat and trust in equal measure. These moments created a peculiar discomfort, the vulnerability of the sleeping child forcing Vigo to confront the reality that he'd become important to someone who had no understanding of what that meant or what risks it potentially created. Maeva noticed everything, cataloging the way Vigo's hand would settle on Jude's shoulder when the boy showed him drawings, how his expression softened incrementally when listening to elaborate stories about school and friends, and the complicated social dynamics of 6-year-olds. She didn't comment on these observations directly, but Vigo felt her attention, her ongoing assessment of whether this developing connection served her son's interests, or simply satisfied Vigo's need for something he couldn't name. Late one evening, after Jude had been transferred to bed, the conversation shifted to territory they'd been avoiding through careful verbal navigation. Maeva asked directly what Vigo wanted from these visits, what he was building toward with his consistent presence and careful attention to her son. The question wasn't hostile, but demanded honesty, required him to articulate intentions he hadn't fully examined. Her exhaustion had returned after a night shift, making her more direct than careful rest might have allowed. Vigo struggled to formulate an answer that wasn't either too revealing or dishonestly vague. He explained about the emptiness his penthouse contained, about how success had delivered everything except reasons to care about any of it. He described the particular loneliness of having power, but no one to use it for, of making decisions that affected hundreds of lives, while his own life remained curiously unpopulated. The admission felt dangerous, acknowledging needs he'd successfully ignored for 15 years through strategic focus on professional objectives. Maeva's response surprised him with its gentleness, suggesting that maybe Jude wasn't the only one who needed what these visits provided. She observed that Vigo seemed different here than he probably was in whatever world he occupied outside this building, that the careful control she'd noticed during their first meeting seemed to relax incrementally with each visit. She asked if he'd considered that maybe he was seeking family, as much as Jude was seeking a father figure. That mutual need didn't diminish the value of connection. The observation struck with uncomfortable accuracy, forcing Vigo to acknowledge that these visits had become the part of his week he most anticipated. His organization's business continued with typical efficiency, territories managed and percentages calculated, but the work felt increasingly mechanical compared to afternoons watching Jude build elaborate dinosaur scenarios, or evenings talking with Maeva about everything and nothing. He was developing an alternate life that ran parallel to his professional existence, and the divergence was becoming harder to navigate. He asks if you're coming every single day. Maeva shared this information with the particular tone mothers used when relating uncomfortable truths about their children's attachments. She explained Jude had started incorporating Vigo into future plans, assuming his presence at theoretical events months away. The boy had drawn a picture of their apartment that included Vigo as permanent resident, crayon figure positioned between mother and son like he belonged there. The revelation created weight in Vigo's chest, awareness of expectations he might not be able to meet. Vigo found himself asking what she wanted, turning the question back to force her own honesty into this increasingly exposed conversation. Maeva's laugh was exhausted and real, admitting she didn't have the luxury of wanting things beyond stable housing and regular meals and her son's happiness. But she acknowledged that Vigo's presence had become something Jude depended on, that pulling back now would create damage she'd have to help her son process. The implicit request was clear without being stated directly. "I'm not going anywhere." The promise came out more certain than Vigo felt, but saying it aloud made it real in ways internal commitment never achieved. He watched Maeva's expression shift, relief mixing with new worry about what staying meant, what complications his continued presence would create. She asked what happened when his professional life intersected with these visits, what protocols existed for when dangerous business required his attention during hours he'd committed to being here. Vigo explained he'd been managing the intersection carefully, had reorganized his schedule, and delegated responsibilities in ways that created protected time, without explaining why that time had become important. His second-in-command had noticed the changes but hadn't questioned them directly, recognizing that bosses didn't owe explanations for personal choices. The careful compartmentalization was working so far, though Vigo acknowledged privately that complete separation might not be sustainable long-term. The conversation had crossed into territory that assumed future, that treated his continued presence as given rather than theoretical. Maeva asked practical questions about logistics and expectations, about what Jude should call him, and whether there were limits to what role Vigo could play. These weren't romantic inquiries, but practical ones, mother establishing parameters for her son's protection. Vigo appreciated the clarity, the absence of assumption that his interest in Jude automatically implied interest in her, beyond co-parenting connection. But something in her careful distance made Vigo aware of what wasn't being said, of the attraction neither had acknowledged during their careful negotiations about Jude's welfare. Maeva was younger than him, but not dramatically so, and her exhaustion couldn't hide the intelligence and strength that had kept her and her son surviving against odds that defeated people with more advantages. He found himself noticing details he'd been deliberately ignoring, the way her smile transformed her features when Jude made her laugh, how her hands moved with unconscious grace, even during mundane tasks. "This is complicated." Maeva stated what they'd both been thinking, acknowledging layers they hadn't explicitly discussed. She explained she couldn't afford complications, that her life required clear categories and manageable relationships, but her voice carried uncertainty that suggested she'd noticed the same unspoken elements he had, that their careful dance around attraction was becoming harder to maintain as visits accumulated into something resembling domesticity. The admission hung between them, too honest to ignore, but too dangerous to pursue directly. Vigo agreed that complexity was accurate description, that he'd entered this situation without strategy or clear endgame. He admitted he was navigating by instinct for the first time in 15 years, making decisions based on what felt right, rather than what served calculated objectives. The confession revealed just how unprecedented this entire development was, how thoroughly Jude and Maeva had disrupted the careful control that had defined his adult existence. Whether that disruption was positive or dangerous remained unclear, though the fact that he kept returning suggested his subconscious had already made assessments his conscious mind hadn't yet accepted. February arrived with the kind of cold that made December seem gentle, temperatures dropping low enough that Maeva's building strained to maintain the heating Vigo had ensured stayed functional. His visits had shifted from occasional to regular, a rhythm established through unspoken agreement that Tuesday and Thursday evenings belonged to this alternate existence. His second-in-command had stopped asking questions about the schedule changes, though Vigo caught speculative looks. The Tuesday meeting Vigo should have attended personally was being handled by subordinates who'd relay decisions for his approval, a delegation that would have been unthinkable 6 months ago. He sat instead on Maeva's worn couch, helping Jude construct an elaborate tower from blocks that kept collapsing at crucial moments. The contrast between this activity and the territorial negotiations happening across town felt absurd. Maeva emerged from the bedroom in her work uniform, preparing for another night shift that would end with dawn breaking over a city Vigo usually only saw from penthouse windows. She'd pulled her blonde hair back efficiently, but exhaustion had become permanent resident in the shadows under her eyes despite improved heating and supplemental groceries. He noticed she'd lost weight, the uniform hanging slightly looser. "Mrs. Chen can't watch him tonight." Mava delivered this news with the particular stress of someone whose carefully balanced logistics had just collapsed. She explained the elderly neighbor had caught whatever flu was circulating through the building, that asking her to take a sick child would be unconscionable. Her hands moved through practiced motions of gathering items for her shift. Vigo heard himself offering before thinking through implications, words forming that committed him to territory he'd been carefully avoiding. He'd stay with Jude, handle bedtime and morning routine, be here when Mava returned from her shift. The offer hung in the apartment's warm air, larger than simple babysitting, crossing boundaries they'd maintained through months of careful interaction. "You don't have to do that." Her voice carried the automatic refusal of someone who'd learned not to rely on others, but underneath lived desperate hope that he'd insist. She turned to face him, and Vigo saw the calculation happening behind her exhausted eyes, weighing his reliability against her limited alternatives. Jude had stopped building to watch this exchange. Vigo explained he had nowhere more important to be, that his evening had been cleared, and staying here solved her problem while creating none for him. The lie was transparent but kind, allowing her to accept without feeling she'd imposed crisis management on someone doing her a favor. He watched her internal resistance crumble under practical necessity. He needs to be in bed by 8. Mava shifted into instruction mode, detailing routines and preferences with the rapid-fire delivery of someone who'd memorized these specifications through nightly repetition. She explained about the nightlight that couldn't be turned off, about how Jude needed water within reach but not too close to the bed, about the specific way his blanket had to be tucked. Vigo committed each detail to memory, with the same focus he applied to business briefings about territory disputes, recognizing that failure here mattered more than any professional mistake could. Mava grabbed her coat and bag with movements that suggested she was already late, already calculating how fast she'd need to walk to make her shift start. The door closed, and suddenly Vigo was alone with a 6-year-old whose enthusiasm about this development was immediate and overwhelming. Jude launched into elaborate plans for their evening together, activities that apparently required staying up past 8 and involved significantly more sugar than his mother would approve. Vigo found himself negotiating with someone who'd clearly inherited Mava's stubborn determination. Bedtime arrived after an evening that had tested Vigo's patience and revealed capabilities he hadn't known he possessed. Jude had resisted sleep with creative arguments and strategic delays, each excuse more inventive than the last. But eventually, exhaustion won over determination, and Vigo found himself sitting on the edge of a small bed, performing the tucking ritual Mava had described. "Will you be here when I wake up?" The question came softly, vulnerability breaking through the evening's performance of energetic confidence. Jude's small hand found Vigo's larger one, holding on with pressure that communicated how much the answer mattered. Vigo confirmed he'd be on the couch, that Mava would be home before breakfast, that everything was fine and safe. Sleep claimed Jude with the sudden completeness of childhood, and Vigo extracted his hand carefully before returning to the living room that felt different in nocturnal quiet. He'd spent evenings here before, but always with Mava's presence providing buffer against the intimacy of truly inhabiting this space. Now he was alone with her life displayed in ways visitors never quite saw. The apartment spoke of Mava's careful management, every object serving purpose, and nothing wasted on decoration that didn't also function. But small touches revealed her attempts to make this space home despite limitations. A photograph of Jude as an infant tucked into the mirror frame, a plant somehow surviving in the kitchen's limited light. His phone buzzed with messages from his organization, questions about the meeting he'd missed, and decisions that required his input. Vigo responded with efficiency that had become automatic, maintaining the business that funded his actual life even while his attention remained divided. The juxtaposition felt increasingly unstable, these parallel existences requiring constant navigation between personas. Hours passed in strange suspension, Vigo checking on Jude periodically with anxiety he recognized as paternal, despite having no template for what paternal actually meant. Each time he found the boy sleeping peacefully, the nightlight creating consistent shadows that suggested safety and routine. The responsibility felt heavier than commanding men who handled violence professionally. Mava returned just before dawn, exhaustion making her movements slow as she climbed the 3 flights of stairs. Vigo heard her key in the lock and stood from the couch where he'd been alternating between work messages and listening for sounds from Jude's room. She entered quietly, surprised to find him still awake, and her expression cycled through relief and guilt. He was fine. Vigo offered this before she could ask. detailing the evening's negotiations and the eventual successful bedtime. Maeva's shoulders dropped as tension released, and she moved to check on Jude with the automatic instinct of mothers who needed visual confirmation, regardless of verbal assurance. She returned with softer expression, reporting he was sprawled across the bed exactly as he should be. They stood in the pre-dawn dimness of her living room, close enough that Vigo could smell the hospital antiseptic that clung to her uniform and see new exhaustion layered over existing fatigue. Something shifted in the space between them, acknowledgement that he'd crossed threshold from visitor to something approaching family. Maeva thanked him with sincerity that made the words feel insufficient. March brought unexpected snow that meteorologists hadn't predicted, late-season storm that blanketed the city in white that felt more like ending than beginning. Vigo stood at his penthouse windows watching accumulation transform familiar landscape into something foreign, and his first thought was whether Maeva's building would maintain heat through temperature drops that accompanied the surprise precipitation. His phone showed 3 missed calls from his second-in-command, messages about a situation requiring immediate attention at one of their collection points, where someone had apparently decided payment was optional. The problem would normally demand his direct involvement, his physical presence communicating consequences that phone calls couldn't convey. But Vigo found himself calculating whether he could delegate this too, whether the emergency was genuine or simply standard crisis. The decision surprised him less than it would have months ago. This choice to prioritize an evening with Jude and Maeva, over maintaining the fear-based respect his organization operated on. He called his second and delivered instructions that were simultaneously specific and delegating, making clear this situation should be resolved without his involvement. The man's pause communicated confusion about this pattern that had become increasingly pronounced. Vigo arrived at Maeva's building as snow continued falling, accumulation making the 3 flights of stairs treacherous in ways building management would never address. He'd brought more supplies with the usual transparent excuses, ingredients for a meal he claimed he'd bought for himself, before deciding he preferred eating here. Maeva accepted the bags with expression that acknowledged the fiction, but appreciated the courtesy of maintaining it. Jude exploded with excitement about the snow, plans already forming for the fort he'd been describing since December's first flakes. The boy had grown over the months, features losing some of their baby roundness, and Vigo noticed with something approaching pride that recent growth spurt had been accompanied by clothes that actually fit properly. Maeva had stopped protesting the supplemental income Vigo provided through increasingly creative justifications. The evening unfolded with easy familiarity, routines they'd established through months of accumulated Tuesdays and Thursdays. Vigo cooked while Maeva changed out of her day clothes, Jude narrating elaborate stories about school drama that apparently rivaled Vigo's organizational politics in complexity. The domesticity felt simultaneously foreign and natural, like he'd been practicing for this life without realizing it was the one he actually wanted. Maeva emerged looking more rested than usual, and Vigo realized she'd been sleeping better since he'd started handling some of the evening responsibilities that used to extend her days impossibly long. She moved around the small kitchen with practiced efficiency, and their movements had developed choreography born from repeated proximity in limited space. Shoulders brushed and hands exchanged items without need for verbal coordination. Dinner conversation revealed that Maeva had been researching nursing programs again, carefully calculating whether online courses could fit around her work schedule if someone reliable could watch Jude during study hours. She didn't look at Vigo when sharing this information, but the implicit question hung in the air alongside the more explicit details about prerequisites and tuition costs. "I'll be here." Vigo stated this simply, making promise that should have terrified him with its implications, but instead felt like acknowledging reality that already existed. He asked about program specifics and timeline, engaging with her plans in ways that confirmed he saw himself as part of their implementation. Maeva's expression showed relief mixed with new vulnerability, this admission that she was planning futures that included him. Jude had been listening with the particular attention children showed when adult conversations affected them directly, and his contribution was immediate request that Vigo help build the snow fort tomorrow since it was Saturday, and no one had work or school. The assumption that Vigo's Saturdays belonged to them now had apparently become established fact in the boy's mind. Reality, Vigo hadn't explicitly agreed to, but found himself accepting. The evening ended with Jude's bedtime routine that Vigo had learned to perform with competence that surprised them both. The boy's requests for 1 more story and 5 more minutes had become familiar negotiations, and Vigo had developed his own strategies for managing the delicate balance between firmness and flexibility. Maeva observed from the doorway sometimes, and Vigo wondered what she saw in these moments. After Jude finally surrendered to sleep, Vigo and Maeva settled into what had become their own routine, coffee and conversation in the living room's dim lighting. But tonight felt different, weighted with the promises he'd made about nursing school and implied Saturdays, acknowledgement that their relationship had shifted from tentative to committed without clear moment of transition. Maeva seemed to feel it too, her usual exhaustion softened by something that might have been contentment. He told his teacher, "You're his dad." Maeva delivered this information with careful neutrality, watching Vigo's reaction to words that redefined everything without his explicit permission. She explained the teacher had mentioned it during recent parent conference, casual reference to Jude's father that Maeva had chosen not to correct in the moment. The decision to let that misidentification stand had been deliberate, she admitted. Vigo processed this information with conflicting reactions he couldn't quite organize into coherent response. Part of him wanted to protest the assumption, to clarify boundaries that protected everyone from expectations he might fail to meet, but larger part recognized that Jude's classification was more honest than technical accuracy about their relationship, that he'd been functioning as father in every way that mattered for months now. I should have corrected him. Maeva offered this as apology and question simultaneously, giving Vigo exit from identification he hadn't chosen. She explained she'd tell Jude to use his name instead, that they'd clarify the relationship in ways that didn't create false expectations. But her voice carried hope that he'd reject this offer, that he'd accept the title her son had already granted him through simple recognition. Don't. Vigo's response came quickly, surprising himself with its certainty. He explained that correcting Jude felt like denying truth more fundamental than biology, that the boy understood their relationship better than adults did with their need for precise definitions. Maeva's expression transformed, relief and joy mixing with tears she tried to hide by looking away. The moment felt larger than it should have, simple acceptance of a child's terminology somehow carrying weight of vows. The conversation shifted to practical implications, discussion about whether Vigo should be listed as emergency contact at Jude's school, whether he should attend the spring concert parents were invited to next month. These mundane logistics felt more binding than any contract Vigo had ever signed, commitments to show up for moments that mattered to a 7-year-old carrying weight his organization's agreements never quite possessed. "I'm not backing out," Vigo stated this firmly, recognizing he needed to say it clearly for both their benefits. He explained he'd already reorganized his entire life around being here, that his organization barely saw him anymore outside of necessary meetings and decisions that couldn't be delegated. His second-in-command was essentially running daily operations while Vigo maintained strategic oversight from distance. Maeva asked the question she'd been avoiding for months. What happened when his professional life eventually demanded more than he could give, while maintaining this parallel existence? Her concern wasn't hypothetical. She'd clearly been thinking about collision courses and impossible choices, about what happened to her and Jude if Vigo's two worlds became mutually exclusive. The vulnerability in her voice revealed how much she'd come to depend on his presence. Vigo didn't have reassuring answer beyond admitting he'd been managing the tension through increasingly creative delegation and strategic absence from situations that used to require his direct involvement. He acknowledged the arrangement wasn't sustainable indefinitely, that eventually he'd need to make more definitive choices about which life he actually wanted to lead. But looking at Maeva in the dim living room light, thinking about Jude asleep in the next room calling him dad, he recognized those choices had already been made. "I want to be here." The admission came with weight of finality, acknowledging this was where he chose to invest himself, regardless of what it cost professionally. Maeva's hand found his across the couch cushions between them, fingers intertwining with familiarity that had accumulated through months of careful proximity. The gesture wasn't romantic exactly, though elements of that lived underneath, but rather acknowledgement of partnership that had formed around raising Jude. April arrived with the aggressive optimism of spring that refused to be deterred by late snow's pessimistic warnings, temperatures rising and ice melting into streams that overwhelmed the city's drainage systems. Vigo had been navigating two lives for 5 months now, and the strain was showing in ways his second-in-command had stopped pretending not to notice. The man had finally asked directly if there was something the boss needed to share about his availability. Instead of responding with the intimidation that normally kept such inquiries theoretical, Vigo found himself explaining in vague terms about personal commitments that required his attention. His second had accepted this with visible confusion, clearly trying to reconcile the boss who'd been legendary for micromanagement with this new version who disappeared for days. The conversation had ended with uneasy agreement that current arrangement could continue, though unspoken concern hung over whether Vigo was losing the edge that had built his empire. The truth was more complicated than losing interest, more like discovering that Empire had been constructed to fill void he'd been addressing through different means now. Maeva and Jude provided purpose that territorial disputes and revenue percentages never quite had, human connection that made professional achievement feel hollow by comparison. Vigo recognized this shift was dangerous, that organizations built on fear required leaders who maintained consistent presence. Maeva's nursing program had started with online courses that consumed her limited free time, laptop open on the kitchen table during hours she used to spend sleeping. Vigo had taken over more of Jude's care, their Tuesday-Thursday pattern expanding to include weekend days and occasional weeknight emergencies. His penthouse had become storage space for clothes he changed into for rare business meetings, place he slept when logistics demanded but never preferred over Maeva's cramped couch. The relationship between Vigo and Maeva had evolved beyond their original careful boundaries, attraction they'd been ignoring becoming harder to dismiss as proximity increased and intimacy accumulated through shared parenting. Small touches lingered longer. Conversations extended into early morning hours after Jude slept, and tension built between them that had nothing to do with their son's welfare. But neither had moved to acknowledge this shift explicitly, some mutual understanding that verbalizing it would require decisions neither felt ready to articulate. Jude's 7th birthday arrived with planning that had consumed weeks of excited preparation, the boys' requests modest but specific about cake flavor, and whether Vigo would be there for the actual celebration. Maeva had tried to organize something larger, party with school friends at the apartment, but Jude had insisted he only wanted Vigo and his mother and Mrs. Chen. The declaration had made Maeva cry, and Vigo had felt something in his chest that might have been his heart remembering how to function beyond mechanical pumping. The birthday evening unfolded with joy that felt almost aggressive in its insistence that happiness was possible and real. Jude's laughter filling the small apartment with sound that transformed space itself. Vigo had brought gifts he'd agonized over selecting, trying to find balance between his resources and what was appropriate for a 7-year-old whose mother worked cleaning hospital floors. He'd settled on books and art supplies, items that couldn't be immediately converted to cash value, but would provide lasting engagement. Mrs. Chen had baked cookies with recipes from her childhood, and the apartment smelled of sugar and vanilla and something indefinably festive. They sang happy birthday while Jude made wishes over candles that Maeva had lit, with hands that trembled slightly, and Vigo found himself hoping desperately that whatever the boy wished for was something within his power to provide. The cake was vanilla again, homemade like the first one he'd heard about at that frozen bus stop that felt like it had happened to different people. After Mrs. Chen left, and Jude had been tucked into bed with his new books, Vigo and Maeva cleaned the small kitchen in companionable silence that had become its own form of communication. But tonight felt weighted differently, charge in the air that suggested something was about to shift or break or transform. Maeva's movements were more careful than usual, like she was building courage for conversation she'd been rehearsing mentally for weeks or maybe months. "I've been thinking about moving." Maeva delivered this information while scrubbing a plate with more force than necessary, not looking at Vigo as she spoke. She explained that her lease was ending soon, that the building's ongoing maintenance issues made staying here increasingly impractical despite functional heating system. Her voice carried careful neutrality, but Vigo recognized this was test or invitation, or possibly both, question about whether his involvement extended to location decisions. Vigo's immediate response was offering to help find something better, words forming before he'd thought through implications of involving himself in her housing decisions. But Maeva finally turned to face him, and her expression showed this wasn't really about finding better apartment in same neighborhood. She was asking something larger, questioning whether their relationship had reached point where consolidation made sense, whether maintaining separate residences served any purpose beyond protecting pride and maintaining appearance of independence. "Move in with me." The words came out roughly, Vigo surprising himself with directness that eliminated careful negotiation they'd been performing around this question for months. His penthouse was excessive for one person, but would comfortably house 3, had views and space and security that this building could never provide. The offer wasn't romance necessarily, though elements of that had been building between them, but practical recognition that they'd already been functioning as family. Maeva's expression cycled through emotions faster than Vigo could track, surprise and longing and fear mixing with practical concerns about what acceptance would mean. She asked about his work, about whether having them in his space would create complications with the professional life he'd been so carefully compartmentalizing. Her questions revealed she understood more about his organization than he'd explicitly shared, that she'd been drawing conclusions from the fragments he'd let slip and the resources he'd deployed so casually. Vigo admitted his organization was an increasingly problematic aspect of life he was trying to figure out how to exit without getting killed in the process. The confession was more honest than he'd planned, acknowledging danger he'd been minimizing in his own mind. He explained he'd been slowly transferring power and building contingencies, creating distance that would eventually allow full separation if he managed it carefully enough. The timeline wasn't certain, but the direction was, and he wanted them safe in his secured building. That's insane. Maeva's assessment was accurate, but delivered with concern rather than judgment. She pointed out he was risking everything he'd built for a relationship that had started with her son ambushing him at bus stop 5 months ago, that the math didn't work out in any rational calculation. But her voice carried wonder underneath the worry, recognition that maybe insane choices were the ones that actually mattered when everything else was just accumulated wealth without purpose. Vigo pulled a small box from his pocket, with hands that had remained steady through countless dangerous negotiations, but trembled now with vulnerability he hadn't allowed himself to feel in 15 years. Inside was a ring that wasn't engagement in traditional sense, but promise about futures they'd build together, symbol of commitment he'd chosen without consulting her about style or preference. The stone was modest by his standards, deliberately selected to be meaningful without being ostentatious, recognition that Maeva would refuse anything that felt like buying his way into her life. This isn't because of Jude. Vigo needed her to understand that distinction, even though Jude was obviously central to how they'd found each other. He explained he'd fallen in love with her somewhere between the heating system repairs and the nursing school planning, that watching her strength and intelligence and determination had transformed what started as convenient co-parenting into something he wanted permanently. The admission felt exposing in ways that made him understand why people avoided this kind of honesty. Maeva took the box with hands that shook, opened it to reveal the ring that caught light from the single overhead fixture, and transformed it into something that looked almost magical. Tears fell without her apparent awareness, and Vigo realized he was holding his breath, waiting for response to a question he hadn't technically asked, but had implied thoroughly enough that rejection would reshape everything. She slipped the ring on her finger, and it fit perfectly through luck, or perhaps just rightness of the moment. Yes. The word was whispered but definitive, acceptance that came with her arms wrapping around him, and her face pressed against his chest, where he could feel her tears soaking through expensive shirt he'd stopped caring about. Vigo held her with grip that probably bordered on too tight, but she didn't complain, just held him back with equal intensity. They stood in that kitchen that had become sacred through shared meals and midnight conversations, making promises that were simultaneously reckless and the sanest thing either had done. The sound of Jude's bedroom door opening made them separate quickly, parental instinct overriding personal moment. The boy appeared sleepy and confused about why adults were awake, and Maeva wiped her eyes quickly while Vigo tried to compose features into something approaching normal. But Jude's perceptive gaze caught the ring on his mother's finger, and his eyes widened with understanding that somehow 7-year-old logic had immediately grasped. Does this mean Vigo's really going to be my dad? Jude asked this with hope so naked it made both adults want to simultaneously laugh and cry. Maeva confirmed this was exactly what it meant, that they were going to be a proper family living together in Vigo's apartment. The boy's reaction was immediate and overwhelming, launching himself at Vigo with force that nearly knocked them both over, small arms wrapping around waist with grip that communicated joy beyond his vocabulary to express. Thank you all for following this story from that frozen Christmas Eve bus stop to this moment of new beginnings. If this journey touched your heart, write in the comments where you're watching from and what part resonated most with you. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video because your support helps me continue bringing these stories of second chances and unexpected families to life.